I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of my phone buzzing against the nightstand. And when I saw it was my barn alarm system going off, my stomach dropped like a stone. The temperature gauge was reading 48 degrees inside the barn when it should have been a steady 62. And outside, the January wind was howling through Cedar Ridge, Montana at -15 with wind chill pushing it down to -30. I threw on my coat and boots, not even bothering with proper clothes over my thermal underwear, and ran the 200 yards from my house to the barn where I kept my 8 Angora goats, 4 alpacas, and a dozen heritage breed chickens that were worth more than my truck. The moment I pushed through the barn door, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. My breath came out in clouds, and I could see the animals huddled together in the corner, their water troughs already starting to freeze over. The heat lamps were off. The radiant heating system was silent. Even the small space heaters I kept as backup were dead. I checked the breaker box with shaking hands, and every switch was in the correct position, but there was no power flowing to anything. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the external electrical box mounted on the side of the barn, the one that connected to the main feed from my house. What I found there made my blood run colder than the Montana night. Someone had cut the main cable. Not accidentally damaged it, not had it fail from the cold, but deliberately severed it with what looked like bolt cutters. The insulated copper wire was sheared clean through, and the metal housing had been pried open with some kind of tool. My name is Vincent Yates, and I had lived on this 5-acre property just outside Cedar Ridge for 3 years. I had bought it specifically because I wanted to raise livestock and have some land to call my own after spending 15 years working as an industrial electrician in Seattle. The property was part of Meadowbrook Estates, a development that had started as a normal rural subdivision, but had recently formed a homeowners association after new construction brought in about 40 additional families. I had voted against the HOA formation, but I was outvoted by people who wanted to maintain property values and ensure community standards. I called the emergency electrician service out of Billings, knowing it would cost me a fortune to get someone out here in the middle of the night during a cold snap. Then I did the only thing I could do, which was move all my animals into my house. The goats were relatively easy to corral into my living room, though they immediately started trying to eat my couch cushions. The alpacas were more difficult because they were nervous, and the wind was making them skittish, but I managed to get leads on all 4 and walk them across the frozen ground. The chickens I carried in a large crate, 3 trips back and forth while my fingers went numb inside my gloves. By the time I had everyone inside and had set up makeshift barriers to keep the goats from destroying everything I owned, it was nearly 5 in the morning. The emergency electrician called to say he could not make it out until later that day because the roads were too dangerous, and he had 3 other emergency calls ahead of mine. I sat on my kitchen floor surrounded by livestock, watching the sun start to rise over the mountains, and tried to figure out who would have done this and why. The answer came at 8:30 in the morning when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Brenda Morrison standing on my porch, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the Arctic temperatures, wearing a puffy designer coat that probably cost more than I made in a month. Brenda was the president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, a 47-year-old former real estate agent who had made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in our covenant with ruthless efficiency. "Mr. Yates," she said, her voice dripping with false pleasantness, "I wanted to inform you personally that the HOA board has taken action regarding your violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our community guidelines." I stared at her, exhausted and furious. Did you cut my barn's electrical feed? She blinked at me with exaggerated innocence. The HOA hired a licensed contractor to disconnect the unauthorized electrical connection to your agricultural structure. You received 3 warnings about the violation. What violation? I had my barn wired by a licensed electrician when I moved in. Everything passed inspection. Brenda pulled out a folder from her expensive leather bag. Section 12. Paragraph 4 clearly states that any outbuildings must match the aesthetic of the main residence and cannot exceed certain size limitations. Your barn is painted red. Your house is painted cream. Additionally, the barn exceeds the maximum square footage for accessory structures by approximately 200 square feet. So you cut my power in the middle of a winter storm. My voice was rising, and I could hear one of the alpacas making nervous sounds behind me. Do you have any idea what you have done? My animals could have frozen to death. Some of those goats are pregnant. The alpacas are worth $15,000 each. Her expression hardened. The HOA is not responsible for your choice to keep farm animals in a residential neighborhood. Furthermore, keeping livestock in your primary residence is also a violation of Section 8, Paragraph 2. You have until 5 p.m. today to remove all animals from your home or face daily fines of $200. She handed me a printed notice and walked away, her heels clicking on the frozen walkway. I stood there holding the paper, reading through the legal language that basically said I was in violation of multiple HOA rules and had to pay a $5,000 fine plus the cost of repainting my barn and either reducing its size or removing it entirely. I called my lawyer friend Derek Patterson, who I had met through a mutual buddy at the shooting range. Derek practiced property law in Billings and had warned me about HOAs when I first bought the place. "Vincent, tell me you are joking," Derek said when I explained the situation. I wish I was. My animals are currently eating my furniture, and I am pretty sure one of the goats just defecated on my hardwood floor. Okay, first thing. Document everything. Take photos of the cut electrical line, photos of your animals inside your house, screenshots of the weather and temperature. Get a statement from your electrician when they arrive about how the power was disconnected. Second, do not pay any of those fines yet. Third, I need to review your HOA covenant and see exactly what kind of legal ground they are standing on. Can they actually do this? Derek sighed. HOAs have a disturbing amount of power, but cutting someone's electricity without warning, especially during dangerous weather conditions, that might cross a line into criminal territory. Let me make some calls. The electrician finally arrived at 2 in the afternoon. His name was Gary, a weathered man in his 60s who had been working in Montana for 40 years. He took one look at the severed cable and whistled low. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, he said. This was not some amateur with hardware store tools. They used professional-grade cutters, and they knew exactly where to cut to disable your barn without affecting your house. The HOA hired someone to do it. Gary looked at me sharply. Your HOA cut your power during this cold snap. Apparently my barn violates their aesthetic guidelines. That is the dumbest thing I have ever heard, and I once saw a guy try to wire his hot tub directly into his main panel without a subpanel or GFCI protection. Gary started pulling supplies from his truck. I can reconnect this, but it is going to take me a few hours. The cable is damaged beyond a simple repair, so I need to run a new feed from your main panel. We are looking at about $1,800 in parts and labor, and that is me giving you my emergency weather discount. I authorized the work because I did not have a choice. While Gary worked, I tried to manage 12 chickens, 4 alpacas, and 8 goats in my 1,500-square-foot house. The goats had discovered my pantry and eaten through half a bag of flour before I caught them. One of the alpacas had somehow gotten into my bedroom and was staring at itself in my dresser mirror. The chickens were perched on every available surface, and I was going to need to do a deep clean of my entire house once this was over. My phone rang. It was my neighbor, Tom Chen, who lived 3 houses down and had always been friendly. "Vincent, I just heard what happened. Brenda is over here bragging about how she finally got you in line. Did she really cut your barn's power? She hired someone to do it, yeah. That is insane. Look, I have been documenting some of the stuff she has been doing to other people in the neighborhood. She fined the Hendersons $500 because their kid's basketball hoop was 6 inches over the property line into the easement. She threatened to put a lien on the Martinez house because they planted vegetable gardens in their front yard instead of decorative flowers. A bunch of us are pretty fed up with her power trip. I am getting a lawyer involved. Good. Let me know if you need anything, and I mean that. I will come testify about her behavior if it helps." By 6 p.m., Gary had restored power to the barn and the heat was slowly building back up. I moved the animals back one by one, checking each of them carefully for signs of cold stress or injury. 2 of the goats were limping slightly, probably from being cramped in my living room, but otherwise everyone seemed okay. The pregnant goats were my biggest concern, but they seemed stable. I took dozens of photos of everything. The cut cable, the animals in my house. The official notice from the HOA. I documented the electrician's bill and got a written statement from Gary about the condition of the wiring and how it had been deliberately cut. Then, I sat down at my kitchen table and started going through every single page of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA covenant. What I found was disturbing. The original covenant from when the subdivision was first developed in 2019 was relatively reasonable. It covered basics like no junk cars in yards, no loud parties after 10 p.m., keep your grass mowed. But there had been amendments. 3 of them, all passed in the last 8 months after Brenda Morrison became HOA president. These amendments added dozens of nitpicky rules about paint colors, fence styles, mailbox designs, landscaping requirements, and yes, restrictions on outbuildings and livestock. The thing was, I had owned my property before most of these amendments were passed. My barn was built in 2020 by the previous owner, and I had bought the place in 2022 specifically because it already had agricultural infrastructure. I had goats and alpacas living there since 2023. The Livestock Restriction Amendment was passed in June of 2025, and it was not supposed to be retroactive. I called Derek back and explained what I found. They cannot retroactively apply new rules to existing structures and existing uses, Derek said. That is called a grandfather clause, and it is pretty standard in property law. Your barn and your animals predate their new restrictions, so you should be exempt. So what do? We sue them. We sue the HOA for property damage, for endangerment of your animals, for harassment, and we go after Brenda Morrison personally if we can prove she acted with malicious intent. But Vincent, I have to warn you, HOA lawsuits can get expensive and drawn out. These organizations often have legal funds specifically for fighting homeowners. I do not care. She could have killed my animals. Some of those goats are pregnant. The alpacas are not cold, hardy breeds. If I had not woken up when I did, or if I had been out of town, they would have frozen to death. Okay, I will draft a complaint and we will file it this week. In the meantime, do not engage with Brenda or anyone else on the HOA board. All communication goes through me from now on. The next morning, I found a new notice on my door. The HOA was fining me $200 per day for keeping livestock in my primary residence. Starting from the date, they saw the animals inside. They had photographic evidence, apparently, because Brenda had taken pictures through my windows while I was moving the animals back to the barn. I forwarded everything to Derek and tried to focus on my work. I did electrical consulting remotely for several companies, which was how I afforded my Montana lifestyle. But it was hard to concentrate when every few hours I checked the barn cameras to make sure my heating system was still running and nobody had vandalized anything else. On the third day after the incident, I got a call from the Cedar Ridge Police Department. Officer Mike Stevens wanted to come by and take a statement about the electrical vandalism. "Mr. Yates, I have to be honest with you," Officer Stevens said as he sat in my living room, notepad out. "This is a tricky situation. The HOA is claiming they had the right to disconnect the power because of covenant violations. They say they sent you warnings. I got letters about the barn color and size, yeah. But nothing that said they were going to cut my power, and definitely nothing that said they would do it during a dangerous cold snap. Did any of the animals die or suffer permanent injury? No, but only because I woke up and got them inside. If I had been out of town for work, or if I had slept through the alarm, they would have frozen." Officer Stevens wrote some notes. "The issue is, we are talking about potential animal endangerment, but the animals were not actually harmed. And the HOA is saying this was a civil matter related to covenant enforcement, not a criminal act. Someone deliberately cut my electrical cable. How is that not criminal? Because they are claiming it was done by a licensed contractor in the course of enforcing HOA rules. Now, personally, I think what they did was reckless and dangerous. But the county prosecutor is going to look at this and see a civil dispute between a homeowner and an HOA. Unless we can prove criminal intent or that they knew the animals would be endangered, it is going to be hard to press charges." I felt the frustration building in my chest. So they can just destroy my property and endanger living creatures and nothing happens. I did not say that. I am writing up a report and I am going to document everything you have told me. If your lawyer wants to pursue this civilly, my report will be available. And if the HOA does anything else that crosses the line into clear criminal activity, we will absolutely get involved. But right now, my hands are tied on the criminal side. After Officer Stevens left, I sat on my porch despite the cold and watched the sun set over the mountains. I had moved to Montana to get away from the bureaucratic nonsense of city life, to have some land and some animals and some peace. Instead, I was dealing with a petty tyrant who thought she could run my life because she had a fancy title and a binder full of rules. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Chen. "HOA meeting tonight at the community center. 7 p.m. You should come." I had avoided HOA meetings since the organization formed, but maybe it was time to show up and face Brenda Morrison in front of the whole neighborhood. I changed into clean clothes and drove to the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, a prefab building at the entrance to the subdivision. About 30 people were there, which was roughly half the homeowners in the development. Brenda sat at the front table with 4 other board members. Stuart Gallagher, the vice president who owned a car dealership in Billings. Patricia Newman, the treasurer who was a retired accountant. Robert Ellis, the secretary who worked from home doing something with computers. And Margaret Flynn, a member at large who seemed to just agree with whatever Brenda said. "We will now call this meeting to order," Brenda said, rapping a gavel against the table like she was a judge. "First order of business is approval of last month's minutes." I sat in the back and waited, watching as they went through the tedious process of approving minutes and discussing the budget for landscaping the common areas. Finally, they got to new business. "We have successfully resolved a major violation involving agricultural structures and livestock," Brenda announced, looking directly at me. "The homeowner has been notified of the necessary corrections, and we expect full compliance within 90 days. I stood up. "I would like to address the board." Brenda's smile tightened. "Homeowners may speak during the public comment period at the end of the meeting. This cannot wait. You cut my barn's electricity during a winter storm. My animals could have died." The room went silent. People started whispering to each other. Stuart Gallagher leaned forward. "Mr. Yates, the HOA took appropriate action to enforce covenant violations after multiple warnings. My barn was built before the new rules were passed. My animals were here before the livestock restrictions were added. You cannot retroactively apply new regulations to existing uses." Patricia Newman shuffled some papers. "The board consulted with our attorney and determined that all structures must comply with current covenant standards, regardless of when they were built." "That is not how property law works," I said, my voice rising. "And even if it was, you do not get to destroy someone's property without due process. You could have put a lien on my property. You could have taken me to court. You could have done a dozen things that did not involve endangering living creatures." "Those animals are livestock, not pets," Brenda said coldly. "They do not belong in a residential neighborhood. If you want to run a farm, buy property that is zoned agricultural." I did buy property zoned agricultural. Cedar Ridge County has this entire area zoned rural residential agricultural. I checked before I bought it. I have 4 acres. I am well within my rights to keep a small number of livestock. Tom Chen stood up. "I would like to make a motion to reverse the board's action against Mr. Yates and to vote on removing the livestock restriction from the covenant." "That motion is out of order," Brenda snapped. "Covenant amendments require a full vote of all homeowners with proper notice, not a snap decision at a monthly meeting." "Then I move that we hold a special election on repealing the livestock amendment," Tom said. "Second," called out another voice. It was Maria Martinez, whose vegetable garden had gotten her in trouble. Brenda looked furious, but the rules were the rules. "Fine. We will schedule a special election for 60 days from now. In the meantime, Mr. Yates is still in violation and still subject to fines." "We will see what a judge says about that," I replied and walked out. The next week was a blur of legal preparation. Derek filed a lawsuit against the Meadowbrook Estates HOA in district court, seeking damages for the cost of repairs, compensation for emotional distress and time lost dealing with the situation, an injunction preventing further harassment, and a declaratory judgment that my barn and livestock were grandfathered under the old covenant rules. We also named Brenda Morrison personally as a defendant, arguing that she had acted with reckless disregard for the safety of my animals. The HOA responded by increasing my fines to $500 per day, claiming I was now in violation of multiple sections of the covenant, including the livestock rule, the outbuilding aesthetics rule, and a new claim that my property was not being maintained to community standards because there were animal footprints in the snow around my barn. Derek got a temporary restraining order that stopped the HOA from taking any further action against me until the lawsuit was resolved. This made Brenda absolutely livid, and she started a whisper campaign in the neighborhood about how I was a troublemaker who was going to bankrupt the HOA with legal fees and raise everyone's dues. But something interesting happened. The more Brenda pushed, the more other homeowners started pushing back. Tom Chen started a Facebook group called Meadowbrook Estates Homeowner Rights, and within a week, It had 40 members sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. The Hendersons posted about the basketball hoop fine. The Martinez family shared photos of their beautiful vegetable garden and the Nastagram they got about it. A guy named Jeff Kowalski shared a letter demanding he repaint his house because the shade of gray he had chosen was not on the pre-approved color list, even though it was only 3 shades different from the approved gray. People were angry, and they were organizing. Meanwhile, my lawsuit was moving forward. We went through discovery, where both sides had to share documents and evidence. What Derek found was damning. Email chains between Brenda and the other board members showed that they had discussed cutting my power specifically during the cold snap, because it would force compliance faster. One email from Brenda literally said, "If he has to deal with frozen animals, he will realize we are serious about enforcement." Derek immediately filed an amended complaint adding punitive damages and arguing that the emails showed willful and wanton misconduct. The local newspaper, the Cedar Ridge Chronicle, picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA president accused of endangering livestock during winter storm." The article quoted me, Derek, Officer Stevens, and even Gary the electrician. It also quoted Brenda, who said I was a disgruntled homeowner trying to avoid legitimate fines, and that the HOA had done nothing wrong. The article went viral in Montana homeowner and farming communities. I started getting calls from people across the state who had their own HOA horror stories. A woman in Bozeman said her HOA tried to fine her for having a wheelchair ramp that was not aesthetically pleasing. A guy in Missoula said his HOA attempted to prevent him from installing solar panels. The stories went on and on. 3 weeks after I filed the lawsuit, I got a call from a producer at a regional news station in Billings. They wanted to do a story about HOA overreach and wanted to interview me and tour my property. I agreed, figuring the publicity might help. The news crew came out on a Thursday afternoon. The reporter, a sharp young woman named Stephanie Carr, interviewed me in front of my barn while my goats photobombed the shot by sticking their heads into the frame. "Mr. Yates, you are facing thousands of dollars in fines from your HOA. Are you worried about losing your property over this?" "I am worried about the precedent this sets," I said. "If an HOA can destroy your property and endanger animals without consequences, what else can they do? Where is the line?" Stephanie also tried to interview Brenda, but Brenda refused to go on camera. Instead, she issued a written statement through the HOA's lawyer saying that the board had acted appropriately and that I was using media manipulation to avoid accountability. The story aired that weekend and got a strong response. The news station's Facebook post about it had hundreds of comments, most of them supporting me and sharing their own negative experiences with HOAs. The special election that Tom Chen had pushed for was scheduled for early March. In the meantime, the anti-Brenda faction in the neighborhood started campaigning hard. They printed flyers outlining all the controversial actions the board had taken. They organized a petition to recall Brenda as president. They even got yard signs made that said, "Reform Meadowbrook Estates." Brenda and her supporters fought back with their own campaign, claiming that without strict enforcement, property values would plummet and the neighborhood would turn into a rundown mess. They sent out glossy mailers showing photos of neglected properties in other subdivisions with warnings like, "Is this what you want for Meadowbrook?" It was absurd. We were fighting a miniature political war over whether I could keep goats in my barn and paint it red. In late February, we had our first mediation session ordered by the court. A professional mediator named Harold Simmons sat us down in a conference room in Billings and tried to find common ground. "Let me start by asking Mr. Yates what outcome he would consider acceptable," Harold said. "I want them to acknowledge that my barn and livestock are grandfathered under the old rules," I said. "I want all fines dropped. I want compensation for my electrical repairs and my legal fees. And I want a guarantee that they will not retaliate against me or anyone else who supported me." Harold turned to Brenda and the HOA's lawyer, a slick guy named Richard Paulson. "And what does the HOA want?" "We want Mr. Yates to comply with the covenant," Brenda said. "Repaint the barn to match his house, reduce its size to meet the square footage limit, and remove the livestock." "Even though his barn and animals predate your new rules?" Harold asked. Richard Paulson stepped in. "The covenant gives the HOA board broad discretion to enforce community standards. We believe all structures should meet current standards." "That is not legal," Derek said flatly. "You cannot retroactively apply restrictions to existing uses. There are decades of case law on this." We went back and forth for 3 hours and got nowhere. Brenda refused to budge on her demands, and I refused to give up my animals or alter my barn. Finally, Harold called it and said we would have to let the judge decide. The special election happened on March 8th. The ballot had 2 questions. First, should the livestock restriction amendment be repealed? Second, should the outbuilding aesthetics requirements be modified to grandfather existing structures? Tom Chen and his group had worked hard to get out the vote. On election day, they organized carpools to make sure everyone got to the community center to cast their ballots. Brenda's faction did the same, and there was a tense energy as people lined up to vote. The results came in that evening. Question 1 passed with 62% voting yes. Question 2 passed with 67% voting yes. The livestock ban was repealed, and existing structures were grandfathered in. I got calls and texts from dozens of neighbors congratulating me. Tom Chen came by with a 6-pack of beer, and we sat on my porch watching the alpacas graze in the pasture. "You did it," Tom said. "We did it," I corrected. I could not have fought this alone, but the victory was not complete. The lawsuit was still ongoing because the special election did not address the property damage or the fines I had already been assessed. The HOA's insurance company was now involved, and they were taking the case seriously because the email evidence made them nervous about liability. In late March, Richard Paulson called Derek with a settlement offer. The HOA would pay for my electrical repairs, drop all fines, acknowledge that my barn and livestock were permitted uses, and issue a formal apology. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit and agree not to seek punitive damages against Brenda personally. "What do you think?" I asked Derek. "It is not a bad offer. You get everything you wanted except making Brenda pay personally. But if we go to trial, there is always risk. Judges can be unpredictable, and even though I think we have a strong case, you never know." "What about criminal charges for what she did?" The county prosecutor reviewed Officer Stevens' report and declined to file charges. They said it was a civil matter. I pushed back, but they were not budging. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to drag Brenda through a trial and make her face consequences for what she did. But another part of me was exhausted from months of fighting and just wanted it to be over. "I will accept the settlement on one condition," I said. "Brenda has to resign as HOA president." Derek conveyed the demand. Richard Paulson called back an hour later and said Brenda refused. "Then we go to trial," I said. The trial was scheduled for May. Derek prepared meticulously, organizing all our evidence, lining up witnesses including Gary the electrician and Officer Stevens, and preparing exhibits showing the emails and the damage to my property. But 2 weeks before trial, something unexpected happened. The HOA's insurance company did their own investigation, and they discovered that the licensed contractor Brenda hired to cut my electrical line was not actually licensed. He was Stuart Gallagher's nephew, a guy who did handyman work, but did not have an electrical contractor's license. This was a huge problem because it meant the work was done illegally, and it exposed both the HOA and Brenda to much more serious liability. The insurance company panicked and pushed for settlement. They increased the offer substantially, adding $25,000 in damages on top of my repair costs and legal fees. They also insisted that Brenda Morrison resign as HOA president and agree not to serve on the board for at least 3 years. This time, Brenda had no choice. The insurance company made it clear they would not cover any judgment if she refused to settle, which meant she could be personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars if we won at trial. She signed the settlement agreement on May 3rd. I got a check for $32,000 covering all my costs plus damages. All fines were officially voided, and Brenda submitted her resignation letter to the HOA board, effective immediately. Tom Chen was elected as the new HOA president in a special election 2 weeks later. His first act was to propose a complete revision of the covenant to remove the most egregious amendments Brenda had pushed through. The homeowners voted overwhelmingly to approve it. But I still was not satisfied, because Brenda had faced no real consequences beyond losing her HOA position and having to resign. She still lived in the neighborhood. She still glared at me whenever she drove past my property. And technically, she had endangered my animals and gotten away with it from a criminal justice perspective. I made an appointment with the county prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Susan Bradley. I brought Derek with me and laid out the entire case. Miss Bradley, I understand you declined to file charges initially because you thought this was a civil matter. But we now have evidence that the electrical work was done by an unlicensed contractor, which is a crime in Montana. We also have emails showing that Brenda Morrison knew cutting the power during the cold snap would endanger my animals, which could constitute animal endangerment or reckless endangerment. Susan reviewed the documents we brought. The unlicensed contractor angle is interesting. Who is this person? His name is Kevin Gallagher. He is Stuart Gallagher's nephew. Susan made notes. I can potentially bring charges against Kevin for unlicensed contracting, but going after Miss Morrison for animal endangerment is still difficult because the animals were not actually harmed. Only because I woke up and saved them, I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. If I had been out of town, or if the alarm had not gone off, they would have frozen to death. How is that not reckless endangerment? Derek added, Montana law defines animal cruelty as knowingly, negligently, or recklessly mistreating animals. The emails show she knew the conditions and knew the animals were in danger. That is at least negligent, possibly reckless. Susan was quiet for a long moment. Let me review the evidence more thoroughly. I am not making any promises, but I will take another look. 3 weeks went by. I went back to focusing on my animals and my work, trying to put the whole mess behind me. The goats had their kids, healthy little babies that bounced around the barn like they had springs in their legs. The alpaca's fleece came in thick and beautiful, and I lined up a buyer who paid top dollar. Life was getting back to normal. Then I got a call from Officer Stevens. Vincent, I wanted to give you a heads up. The prosecutor is filing charges against Brenda Morrison and Kevin Gallagher. My heart started pounding. What charges? Kevin is being charged with unlicensed contracting and criminal mischief for damaging your electrical system. Brenda is being charged with 2 misdemeanor counts: conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and reckless endangerment of animals. It was not murder charges, but it was something. It was accountability. The arraignment was held in early June. I sat in the courtroom and watched as Brenda and Kevin stood before the judge and entered not guilty pleas. Brenda looked smaller somehow, diminished without her HOA power behind her. Kevin just looked nervous. Their trial was set for August. In the meantime, the local news picked the story back up, this time with the angle that an HOA president was facing criminal charges for actions taken in her official capacity. It became a talking point in state politics, with some legislators saying they wanted to introduce bills limiting HOA powers. I testified at the trial on August 15th. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers. The prosecutor, Susan Bradley, walked me through the entire timeline of events, showing the jury photos of the cut electrical cables, pictures of my animals huddled in my living room, and the weather data showing how dangerous the cold snap was. The defense attorney tried to argue that Brenda had no idea cutting the power would endanger the animals, but then Susan introduced the emails. The jury saw Brenda's own words. "If he has to deal with frozen animals, he will realize we are serious." The trial lasted 3 days. Kevin Gallagher took a plea deal partway through, agreeing to testify against Brenda in exchange for probation and a fine. He testified that Brenda specifically told him to cut the power late at night when I would be asleep, and to do it during the coldest part of the storm for maximum impact. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on both counts against Brenda Morrison. The sentencing hearing was in September. I gave a victim impact statement, describing the terror of finding my animals freezing, the expense and stress of the legal battle, and the months of harassment I endured. The judge, an older man named Richard Torres, looked at Brenda with something like disgust. "Miss Morrison, you abused a position of trust in your community. You used HOA authority as a weapon against someone you disagreed with, and you showed reckless disregard for the welfare of living creatures. This court takes animal welfare seriously." He sentenced her to 90 days in county jail with all but 30 days suspended, meaning she would serve 30 days and the rest would be probation. She also had to pay restitution to me for court costs, perform 200 hours of community service at an animal shelter, and was prohibited from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. It was not a long sentence, but seeing Brenda Morrison led out of the courtroom in handcuffs was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. The story made national news. HOA reform became a hot topic in Montana and several other states. I started getting invited to speak at homeowner groups and property rights organizations, sharing my experience and advocating for legislative limits on HOA powers. Back in Meadowbrook Estates, life improved dramatically under Tom Chen's leadership. The HOA became what it was supposed to be: a simple organization that maintained common areas and handled basic issues, not a tyrannical board micromanaging everyone's lives. The dues went down because we were not spending thousands on legal fees. People started talking to each other again, instead of reporting each other for violations. I kept my goats and alpacas, and my red barn stood proudly on my property. Sometimes tourists driving through would stop and ask to take pictures with the animals because they had seen the news stories. I always said yes. The whole experience taught me that standing up to petty tyrants is worth it, even when it is exhausting and expensive, because some battles are about more than just winning. They are about setting precedents and protecting rights, and making sure that people with a little bit of power cannot abuse it without consequences. On a cold evening in November, almost a year after Brenda cut my electrical line, I stood in my barn with a space heater humming in the corner and my animals safe and warm around me. The newest baby goats were jumping on and off a wooden platform I had built for them, their little hooves clicking against the wood. The alpacas were munching hay peacefully, their thick winter coats already coming in. The chickens were settling into their roosts for the night, making soft, contented sounds. Tom Chen came by with a bottle of whiskey. We sat on hay bales and poured ourselves drinks. "Did you ever think it would get this big?" he asked. "No," I admitted. "I just wanted my animals to be safe and warm. I wanted to live my life on my own property without someone telling me my barn was the wrong color." "You started something, Vincent. There are HOA reform bills going through the legislature now because of what happened to you. You might actually change things for a lot of people." I took a sip of whiskey and felt the burn down my throat. I just hope Brenda learned something from all this. I doubt it. People like her never think they are wrong, but at least she cannot hurt anyone else for a while. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside and the peaceful sounds of the animals inside. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Montana Property Rights Coalition wants you to speak at their conference in January. Interested?" I texted back. "Sure." Maybe some good could come from all this. Maybe my stubborn refusal to back down when Brenda Morrison tried to bully me would help other people stand up to their own petty tyrants. Maybe the laws would change, and HOAs would have less power to destroy people's lives over paint colors and farm animals. Or maybe I was just a guy who got lucky that his animals did not freeze to death, and who had the resources and stubbornness to fight back. Either way, I was still standing. My barn was still red. My goats were still bleeding. And Brenda Morrison was on probation, stuck cleaning kennels at an animal shelter, hopefully learning a tiny bit of empathy for the creatures she had endangered. The winter settled in around Cedar Ridge, the mountains turning white with snow, the temperatures dropping into negative numbers night after night. But my barn stayed warm. My heating system ran perfectly on its newly installed, professionally licensed electrical feed. My animals thrived. I got a Christmas card from Maria Martinez, thanking me for standing up to the HOA and including a photo of her family in front of their beautiful vegetable garden, now officially allowed under the revised covenant. Tom Chen sent a group text to everyone in the Homeowner Rights Facebook group with a photo of the new HOA board, diverse and reasonable people who actually cared about the community instead of controlling it. I also got a letter from Brenda's lawyer saying she was appealing her conviction. Derek laughed when I forwarded it to him. Let her appeal. The evidence was overwhelming and the judge followed the law. She is just burning more money. In January, I spoke at the Montana Property Rights Coalition conference in Helena. About 200 people showed up, homeowners from across the state who had their own HOA horror stories or who wanted to prevent HOAs from forming in their neighborhoods. I told my story, showed photos of my animals and my barn, and talked about the importance of property rights and reasonable limits on HOA authority. A state senator named Patricia Reeves approached me afterward. "Mr. Yates, I am introducing a bill that would require HOAs to give 30 days notice before taking any enforcement action, would limit fines to reasonable amounts, and would prohibit HOAs from cutting utilities or taking actions that could endanger people or animals. Would you be willing to testify in support of it?" "Absolutely," I said. I testified before the state legislature in February. It was intimidating, sitting at a table in front of a room full of senators and representatives, but I told my story clearly and honestly. Other people testified too, sharing their own experiences with HOA overreach. Property rights groups supported the bill. Even some HOA management companies supported it because they were tired of dealing with rogue boards that created legal liability. The bill passed in March and was signed by the governor in April. It was not perfect. HOAs still had a lot of power, but it was a step in the right direction. And I had helped make it happen. Back home, spring arrived and my goats had another round of babies. The alpacas were sheared and their fleece sold for excellent prices. I planted a garden right in my front yard where everyone could see it, with tomatoes and peppers and squash. Nobody from the HOA complained because the new board did not care about that kind of thing. Kevin Gallagher finished his probation and moved to Wyoming, probably to escape the shame of being known as the unlicensed contractor who helped an HOA president attack someone's livestock. Stuart Gallagher resigned from the HOA board and kept his head down, trying to distance himself from his nephew's actions and his own role in supporting Brenda's vendetta against me. Brenda Morrison served her 30 days in jail, completed her community service, and put her house up for sale. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was moving to Arizona to live with her sister. Part of me felt a small amount of pity for her. She had probably started out thinking she was doing good, maintaining standards and protecting property values. And somewhere along the way, she turned into a tyrant who thought rules were more important than people or animals. It was a cautionary tale about power and ego, and what happens when you forget that your neighbors are human beings, not just violators of code sections. The day Brenda moved out, I was in my barn fixing a section of fence. I saw the moving truck pull up to her house, saw her directing the movers with that same imperious attitude she had always had. She never looked toward my property, never acknowledged me or what she had done. Tom Chen came by that evening. She is gone. I saw. How do you feel? I thought about it, relieved mostly, and grateful that it is over, and still angry about what could have happened if things had gone differently. Your animals are okay, though. That is what matters. Yeah, I agreed, watching my goats play in the pasture. That is what matters. Life moved on. The story eventually faded from the news cycle, replaced by other scandals and controversies. Meadowbrook Estates became a normal neighborhood again, boring and peaceful in the best way. I kept doing my electrical consulting work, kept raising my animals, kept living my life on my terms. Sometimes people recognized me when I went into town. "Hey, you are that guy who fought the HOA," they would say. Some wanted to shake my hand. Some wanted to share their own HOA stories. I listened politely and sympathized, but I was ready to be done being known as the HOA guy. I just wanted to be Vincent Yates, electrician and small-scale livestock keeper, living quietly in Montana. But I could not quite leave it alone entirely. When people contacted me asking for advice on fighting their own HOA battles, I helped when I could. I connected them with Derek or other property rights lawyers. I shared my documents and timelines as templates. I testified in support of additional HOA reform bills in other states. Because the thing was, what happened to me was not unique. All across America, HOAs were wielding power with minimal oversight, enforcing petty rules, destroying property, ruining lives. Someone needed to fight back, and I had the experience and the platform to help. A year and a half after that cold January night when my barn alarm woke me up, I got an email from a woman in Colorado whose HOA was trying to force her to remove a medical access ramp from her house because it did not meet their aesthetic guidelines. She was disabled and needed the ramp. The HOA did not care. I spent 2 hours on the phone with her, walking through strategies, connecting her with legal resources, giving her courage to fight. A few months later, she emailed to say she had won. The HOA backed down after she threatened to file an Americans with Disabilities Act complaint. That felt good. Maybe that was my purpose now, helping other people navigate the nightmare I had lived through. Meanwhile, my animals continued to thrive. I added 2 more alpacas, rescues from a farm that was closing down. I expanded my chicken coop and got some fancy heritage breeds, selling eggs to neighbors and at the farmer's market. The goats produced kids every spring that I sold to other small farmers. My barn stayed red. Nobody said a word about it. On the 2nd anniversary of Brenda cutting my power, Tom Chen organized a neighborhood barbecue at the community center. It was a warm July evening, and most of the neighbors showed up with food and drinks and kids running around. Someone had rented a bounce house. There was a volleyball net set up. Tom stood up on the picnic table and called for attention. I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped transform this neighborhood over the past 2 years. We went from being afraid of our HOA to having an HOA that actually serves us. We went from reporting each other over stupid violations to being actual neighbors who help each other out. And a lot of that started because one guy refused to back down when he was being bullied. People looked at me and started clapping. I felt my face get hot with embarrassment. Vincent showed us that standing up to petty tyrants is possible, Tom continued. That you can fight back against abuse of power and win. So here is to Vincent Yates and his red barn and his goats and alpacas, and everything he taught us about property rights and backbones. Everyone raised their drinks and cheered. Later, Maria Martinez hugged me and said, "You changed my life. I was so scared of the HOA, and watching you fight them gave me courage to fight for my garden." Jeff Kowalski shook my hand. I repainted my house whatever shade of gray I wanted, and when I got a letter about it, I told them to pound sand. They backed off immediately because they did not want another lawsuit. Story after story, people told me how my fight had rippled through the neighborhood and given them permission to stand up for themselves. I went home that night feeling like maybe all the stress and money and frustration had been worth it. Not just for me and my animals, but for everyone who came after. The Montana winter came again, as it always did, cold and harsh and beautiful. My barn heating system ran perfectly. My animals stayed warm and safe. I slept soundly, no longer jolting awake at every notification, no longer worried about what Brenda Morrison might do next. She was gone. The bad rules were repealed. The new HOA board was reasonable. Life was good. I stood in my barn one December evening, a year of peace behind me, watching snow fall past the windows while my goats dozed in their stalls and the alpacas munched hay contentedly. This was what I had wanted when I moved to Montana. This quiet, this simplicity, this life where I could take care of animals and do my work and not bother anyone. I had almost lost it because one woman with a title and a grudge decided my barn was the wrong color. But I had fought for it and I had won, and now I would protect it fiercely for as long as I lived here. My phone rang. It was Derek. "Vincent, you are not going to believe this. Brenda Morrison filed a lawsuit against you from Arizona." My stomach dropped. "What?" "She is suing you for defamation and emotional distress, claiming you ruined her reputation and caused her to lose her position in the community." I was quiet for a long moment, processing this absurdity. Then I started laughing. I could not help it. The audacity of this woman was almost impressive. "Let me guess," I said. "You think it is a frivolous lawsuit that will get thrown out immediately?" "Absolutely. She is representing herself, which is always a bad sign. The filing is barely coherent. But it means more legal nonsense for you to deal with. I am sorry. Do not be sorry. We will get it dismissed, and maybe the judge will sanction her for filing a frivolous suit. How much more damage can she do to herself? That is the spirit. I will draft a motion to dismiss, and we will knock this out quickly. After I hung up, I stood there shaking my head. Some people never learned. Some people would always be the victim in their own story, always blame everyone else, never take responsibility. But that was Brenda's problem, not mine. I walked back to my house through the snow, my breath forming clouds in the cold air, lights from my barn glowing warm behind me. Whatever Brenda threw at me next, I would handle it. I had won against worse odds. I had fought an entire HOA board and prevailed. I had changed laws. I had helped other people fight their own battles. One bitter woman filing a bad lawsuit from Arizona was nothing I could not handle. Inside my house, I made coffee and sat by the window looking out at my property. 5 acres of Montana land, a red barn, healthy animals, peace and quiet. This was mine. I had earned it, paid for it, fought for it, and I would keep fighting for it as long as I needed to. The lawsuit got dismissed 2 months later, exactly as Derek predicted. The judge actually did sanction Brenda for filing a frivolous suit, ordering her to pay my legal fees for defending against it. She never paid, but I did not expect her to. It was enough that she lost again, that she kept losing every time she tried to come after me. Eventually, finally, she stopped. No more lawsuits, no more contact, just silence. Years passed. The HOA drama became a story I told occasionally when people asked how I ended up speaking at property rights conferences or testifying before legislatures. The animals came and went, some sold, some passed away from old age, new ones added to replace them. The barn aged gracefully, the red paint weathering to a rustic charm. Tom Chen remained HOA president for 3 years before stepping down and being replaced by Patricia Newman, who turned out to be much more reasonable once she was not under Brenda's influence. The neighborhood continued to thrive under sensible leadership. I heard through random Facebook posts that Brenda Morrison had joined an HOA board in Arizona and was already causing problems there. Some people never changed. But she was Arizona's problem now, not Montana's. I kept my animals, kept my red barn, kept my life exactly how I wanted it. And every winter when the temperature dropped and the wind howled through Cedar Ridge, I checked my barn heating system and thought about that January night when everything could have gone so wrong. But it did not go wrong. I woke up in time. I saved my animals. I fought back. I won. And that made all the difference.